Welcome everyone to this meetup of the Menopause at Work Professional Web Network. My name's Thea O'Connor and I'm a workplace wellbeing advisor, and I specialise in supporting midlife women, specialising their wellbeing in the workplace. And of course, menopause is part of that. So I help organisations become menopause friendly. So the purpose of these meetups is very much to allow workplace professionals who are interested in this topic to come together and to learn from their peers, but also learn from experts like Carolyn today, and also to be inspired when we hear what other people are doing. Because even though menopause itself is as old as life itself, this topic in the workplace, it's relatively new. And so I think it's great to share approaches and ideas and best ways of doing things. So just to give you an idea of how today is going to be structured, I've had a very generous offer from one of the participants to help set the scene by sharing a personal account in relation to today. We'll then hand over to Carolyn, who I'll introduce formally when we get to that point. And she's going to share some of her research and also her clinical experience related to this topic. We'll have time for Q&A, and then at the end, I'm going to put you into breakout rooms because I really want to explore implications for workplaces. What are some of the opportunities and what are some of the obligations? I do allow until 1:15 for these sessions. We'll see how we go, but if you can allow that time, great. If not, you're still going to get heaps out of today. So as mentioned, I am recording today's session, so you will be able to catch up afterwards and replay this. So I'd actually like to start by handing over, as I said, to a generous participant today, Tracy, just to help us set the scene and help us to understand why is this topic so important. And it's certainly not just academic, even though we will be hearing some great academic input from Carolyn. So can I just hand over to you, Tracy, for a brief intro and brief account of what your experience has been in relation to today's topic?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Thea. My experience really commenced over 10 years ago now. I physically hadn't started the menopause process. So I had some pretty strong symptoms, but unfortunately I wasn't educated on menopause, and I had no idea that they were menopause symptoms. So it started with a really big impact on my sleep. So for about 9 months, I was waking up multiple times during the night and became totally exhausted. And it was the night sweats, but I never knew night sweats were part of menopause. I thought that I went and bought a lighter doona and all other manner of things trying to rectify the problem. In the end, I went to a GP and was educated that was the night sweats as part of menopause, and I was simply exhausted. The other thing that was really debilitating was brain fog. So I would be talking to somebody in the workplace and of course socially, but mid-sentence I would stop and be unable to remember what the next word was. And I knew it. It was like the words were dangling right in front of my face and I just couldn't capture them. And I kept thinking, this must be what it's like to be like 80 or 90 and starting to lose your mind. But it was really terrifying. Also, my short memory took a complete holiday. So I'd be leaving to go to work for a morning. I would come out the door and then I'm like, oh God, did I turn the iron off? And I'd have to come back. And that was happening on a regular basis. And I'd never been like that before. And again, it was all very anxiety inducing. And at the very same time of all these experiences, I was starting a new role with a very young CEO and a young manager. And it was really hard because I was trying to hide what was going on for me. I didn't feel comfortable to share what was happening. And they would be telling me things as part of induction or training or just generally day to day. And then I would turn around and ask a question. They'd say, we just told you that, with eye rolls. So trying to hide it was really, really difficult. And as I said, my anxiety was at an all-time high. I was concerned that I was forgetting important things and that they would think I was incompetent in my new job. And the worst of it was I actually thought I had early onset Alzheimer's. And I remember once having people for dinner and I stood there at the dining table and I couldn't remember where the knives and forks went. And I just lost it. Fortunately, the good news is that these symptoms all passed, and that was just in time and with the help of medication. So that was my experience. I had no physical symptoms, but it was all cognitive, and it was really, really scary, but mostly because I didn't know. So that's my story.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And the words that stood out for me was that it was a terrifying experience, not just unsettling, but terrifying. And to go through that in a new role, I can only imagine what that must have been like. And I also picked up how you talked about it's the double stress of then also trying to hide it and the anxiety that creates, which is just going to make your cognition even worse.
Absolutely. It was terrible.
And just one other question, had any other woman in your life ever mentioned changes to your brain could be part of the menopause transition?
No, the only thing I knew about menopause for my whole life up until my own experience was that you can get really moody and cranky, and that hot flushes. And I didn't experience those. I did have hot flushes much later on, but at that point, all my experience was as I shared.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing that, Tracy, because it really highlights why it's so important that we women are educated about what to expect. And a lot of the women that I talk to do find this part of the symptoms often the most unsettling, because of course, brain changes does affect your work. But I think even more so, no one ever told us that this could happen or what to expect. So thanks so much, Tracy, for giving a bit of a personal slant to today's topic. And I'd now really love to introduce Carolyn Gervich, and I'm really happy that she's made time to chat to us today. So, and what I love about Carolyn is that she's both a clinical neuropsychologist, so she treats people one-on-one, people having trouble with their brains, but she's also a researcher as well, so can bring quite a bit of rigor to this topic. So one of Carolyn's research projects has been changes in cognition during the menopause transition. And when I saw that she was researching this, I just had to get in touch, and I actually participated in her study. And Carolyn, I have to say, it wasn't nice. I didn't like doing those cognitive tests, particularly that one where you had to remember all the words over and over again. I certainly did not excel, and I found it quite stressful. And I will be interested to see if there's been any changes 12 months from now, because that's when she's going to retest me. But anyway, I'd love to hand over to you, Carolyn, just to help us understand what's happening in our brains during this life stage and what can we do about it.
Thank you very much, Thea. I'll just double check you can see my slides okay?
Yeah, it's all perfect.
Excellent. All right, thank you. So this idea of brain fog during menopause is something that's received a lot of attention really in very recent years in the media. And as everyone here knows, menopause is something that every female will go through a stage of life. And the symptoms that women experience can be quite different, but about 2/3 of women experience this idea of brain fog. So what I thought I would cover today are the following things. One, does cognition change during menopause? And if so, is this common? What are the impacts of cognitive changes during menopause from a research perspective? I guess hearing Tracy's story and your own personal experiences, you'll know your own individual impacts, but I will just cover the sorts of research that's out there as well. Then I thought I'd touch on, and Tracy also brought this up, how can you tell the difference between menopausal brain fog and dementia? I also want to talk a little bit about what causes these cognitive changes during menopause, and then finishing on what can help people maximize their cognition during this stage of life. So what does brain fog during menopause actually refer to? The term brain fog itself is a newish term. It's not a medical term. It's not a term that I was introduced to when I was studying neuropsychology many years ago. It's just a term that I think the media and the general community have adopted to describe the sorts of changes that happen to their brains and to their thinking skills during menopause. It's also popped up in a bit in the context of COVID and in other areas, but it just refers to this general fogginess in thinking. So this graph here shows a study that was in 12,000 or just over 12,000 females, and it shows the prevalence or how common people reported poor memory and forgetfulness across different age groups. And you can see this middle group, the midlife group, which matches up to the age of menopause, is where there's a peak in this complaints of poor memory and forgetfulness. So this suggests that they gradually increase, peak during menopause, and then drop away. So we also, in our research, had a look at, we did it as part of our survey that Thea completed. We included a questionnaire, which is called the Everyday Memory Questionnaire. And this just asks people about their everyday experiences of their memory in day-to-day life. And then we categorized people based on their stage, their menopause stage. So we had a group of people who are premenopausal, so experiencing a regular menstrual cycle and in their reproductive years, then a perimenopausal group. So this is a time frame around the menopause, so in the lead up to menopause, where your menstrual cycle might become variable. And this perimenopausal period can span up to 10 years for some women. And then we had people who were 1 to 2 years after their final menstrual period, 3 to 6 years, and 7 years postmenopausal. And you can see the orange group, that perimenopausal group, is really where there is a peak in the complaints of everyday memory problems. And the most common problems that people reported was that tip of the tongue experience, which again, Tracy referred to, where you just can't find the word, your brain is suddenly blank. And within the perimenopausal group, 40% of women experience this once or more per day. The other really common symptom that people reported was having to check whether you've done something that you should have done. For example, leaving the oven on that was provided before. So that about a third of perimenopausal women are experiencing this once or more per day. So these kind of subjective cognitive difficulties are this is what the experience of brain fog is. So I just wanted to talk about the different steps that are involved in everyday memory. So it's not just one thing that you just have to remember something. There are lots of steps involved in the whole journey of remembering anything. The very first phase of memory is working out what we're going to focus on in our environment. So we always have lots of different sensory inputs. We see things, taste things, smell things, feel things, and hear things. And as much as we would like to divide our attention between all of these, we generally focus on one thing at a time. Our attention might shift really quickly between lots of things, but the very first stage of encoding and forming a memory, like what's going on in a conversation or reading something and remembering what you've read, what you've seen, is being able to attend to that sense or that piece of information. So that's the very first step. Then after that, we have to be able to encode the memory, so move it from just being able to attend to it to really holding it now in our minds and then moving it through to encoding it. Then we have to store it effectively. And then at some point in the future, we have to retrieve it. That might be short-term memory, so just a couple of minutes later where you try and remember what was said earlier in the conversation, or it might be days later where we're retrieving it from our long-term memory, or even half an hour later, then it's still retrieving that information from our long-term memory. So these are lots of steps involved in the simple process of remembering conversations, remembering information. So as a neuropsychologist, we have a look at all of these steps that are involved in being able to learn and remember new information. And we also are interested in people's experiences, their subjective experience of cognitive change or of brain fog. So during menopause, what we actually find is that while people experience what can be quite debilitating subjective changes in their cognition, so everyday memory problems, word finding difficulties, when I see people generally during the menopause transition clinically, we actually don't see significant changes, mostly neuropsychological performance. So when we break up the ability to attend, the ability to hold things in your working memory, the ability to learn and remember new lists, like a word list that Thea was referring to in our study, people perform in normal limits. So there's not a neurological change or a cognitive change. There might be a temporary decrement in or a drop in processing speed, so how quickly you can process information. There might be also, it's been shown, a temporary change in being able to remember lots of words, but it's still, even though there's a temporary drop or change, it's still within the normal limits. And when I say normal limits, That's when these tasks have been completed by lots and lots of people of a similar midlife age group, males and females, and you compare someone's performance to the normative data. So people still perform during menopause in the normal range. And for our own survey results, we're also seeing a similar thing, that while people are reporting lots of everyday memory problems, tip of the tongue, forgetfulness, that sort of thing, it's not really relating to any objective change in neuropsychological performance. The only area that might be associated with menopausal cognitive or day-to-day difficulties is attention. So if you think back to that, all those different processes that are involved in being able to remember, the ability to attend and I guess multitask and hold lots of bits of information in your mind, that's the one area that might be changing slightly, and that might be the trigger for that everyday memory problem. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about what research has shown in terms of the impact of these cognitive symptoms or forgetfulness, concentration problems during menopause. So this was a study that was done nearly 10 years ago in just under 900 women. It was a UK study. And so all of these women were in the midlife, and they were at different stages of that perimenopausal transition, and they're all working, and they talked about the symptoms that were most problematic at work and at life in general. And you can see these cognitive problems, poor concentration, tiredness, and poor memory were the symptoms that were most problematic within the workplace. In terms of life in general, I think tiredness and sleep disturbance seem to have a greater impact on life in general, but poor memory and poor concentration were still problematic for workplace and for life in general. So these everyday sort of memory problems are common during menopause, and they do have an impact both on work and on life in general for many women. So now coming to the point of how can you tell the difference between menopause, brain fog changes or memory changes, and dementia? It is a really common question, and people are generally very concerned about dementia. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. So dementia is an umbrella term, and there are lots of different pathologies that can cause dementia, and Alzheimer's is the most common one. So in red here, I've highlighted one of the key features of Alzheimer's is that it's progressive. It gets worse over time, whereas the brain fog or the everyday memory problems that people experience during menopause generally don't progress. People experience them, they might be on and off, but they're not something that are there and just progressing and gradually getting worse and worse and worse. The other key point is that the typical age of diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease is 65 years plus, and then it gets more common as people get older. So generally, people go through the menopause transition around median age of 51. And so generally, people are too young to get Alzheimer's, although there is an early onset Alzheimer's, but it's not very common. So the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease in the mild stages, early stages, generally involve things like people repeat questions and conversations, but there is a forgetfulness. So it is that people, when I would assess them in a neuropsychological assessment, they can't form new memories. So even when they're really concentrating and really focusing and trying their hardest, they cannot learn a list of words, that there is just a huge amount of forgetfulness. The brain can no longer form new memories. That is one of the key differences when I see someone who is going through menopause transition and they're concerned about their memory. They do experience difficulties in day-to-day life, but when I assess them and they're concentrating, they don't have a problem during my assessments. There's also other symptoms in the early stages of Alzheimer's that might include wandering and getting lost in familiar neighbourhoods, but having difficulty using appliances that you might have been able to use in the past, those kinds of things. And then the symptoms get more severe as the course of the disease progresses. So I guess the key difference is if you kind of want to test yourselves and know whether you need to go and seek further help, the key thing is if you really try and concentrate and focus on something and try and learn something new, can you? And if you consistently are struggling to learn anything new, then it might be worthwhile seeking out some professional help. So the next area I wanted to talk about is what causes the cognitive changes, the everyday memory problems during the menopause transition. So during menopause, our hormones change. This is what drives the menopause. So during our reproductive years, we see this cyclical fluctuation in our hormones, and the key hormones I'm talking about are estrogen and progesterone. And then during perimenopause, so that menopause transition, even though this graph here shows this gradual decline in estrogen levels, estradiol is the most common type of estrogen we have in our body during our reproductive years. So it drops off during menopause. What actually, it's a bit more like a roller coaster. It actually fluctuates a lot, but gradually declines. And estrogen, lots of animal studies and lots of research has shown that estrogen has lots of really protective, good benefits on our brain function. So when it drops off, this is one thing that might contribute to those everyday memory type problems that people experience during menopause. And indeed, studies have shown that as we go through from premenopausal, perimenopausal to postmenopausal, which is what this first graph shows, we see a drop or a decline in estradiol, so estrogen levels, they drop. So do progesterone levels. Progesterone is another hormone that also has good protective effects on our brain function. And one of the other hormones that changes during menopause and actually increases is another hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. Studies have also shown that when you measure estrogen levels, they are correlated, so associated with how well people can retrieve information from their memory. So with lower estrogen levels, there's poorer memory performance. So this is one factor that might contribute to the everyday memory problems that people experience during menopause. Just wanted to unpack this a little bit further. So I've just on this slide put all the different or some different thinking skills or cognition functions, and I just wanted to map out how they relate and where they sit within our brain. This is a very simplistic overview of cognition and brain function, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things, and I'll show you why in a moment. At the bottom here, we have what's called our temporal lobe in our brain in green, and this is where our hippocampus, which is where our memories sit, basically. So this is this green part of the brain. This light blue part here is where our attention sits within the brain, and this darker blue part at the front is called our frontal lobe. And this is the part of our brain that helps us select what we're going to focus on, problem solve, decision make. It's really the home of our behavior, our personality, and really important part of our brain. So now I wanted to show you another slide. So this is just a brain cut in half down the middle, or a schematic picture of that. And you can still see these blue and green highlighted sections of the brain at the front of the brain and the temporal lobe. And what you can see is there's lots of red triangles and blue circles. And what these are, the red triangles are estrogen receptors. So they're receptors in our brain that respond to estrogen that floats around our body and into our brain. And the blue circles are progesterone receptors. And what I wanted to show you is while these hormones are really important in regulating our reproductive function, so our menopause transition, they're also really heavily important in different brain areas that are very relevant to our memory and our thinking skills and our decision making. So when they start to fluctuate during menopause and then decline eventually, we're losing the effect of these brains in really important brain areas, or brain areas that are really important for our thinking skills. So the other part of this slide shows different neurotransmitter pathways. So you might have heard of dopamine and serotonin, glutamatergic pathways and GABAergic pathways. Those pathways and brain pathways are really relevant to our mood, particularly serotonin, and our thinking skills for the other pathways. So estrogen and progesterone interact with all of these chemical pathways in our brain that are really relevant to how we feel and how we think. So it makes sense that when they fluctuate and then decline, you can have changes in thinking skills and also in our mood. So I guess that's the first factor that might contribute to our cognitive changes, the hormone changes. The second factor is that there are lots of other symptoms that can happen during menopause. You may or may not experience these, but they can also impact thinking skills. So we know that sleep, when anyone's tired, you know that when you haven't slept well, your thinking skills are not as sharp. From our own research, we found one of the biggest predictors of cognitive change during menopause was stress and anxiety. So this is not surprising. We know, again, when we're anxious, it's hard to think clearly, but stress and anxiety, as well as some of the physical symptoms of menopause, are factors that can really influence that day-to-day memory problems that people can experience. And going through menopause, generally women are at a time of their life where there's a lot going on. We often have teenage children, we have households, we have work, we're often in the prime of our life. So there are lots of factors that might contribute to exacerbate stress and anxiety. And sometimes just the thought of what's going on with my body can also make the anxiety worse. So it's something that's really important to try and get a handle on and do your best to manage stress and anxiety, because this can then help the cognitive symptoms as well. So the final point I wanted to talk about was what can help maximize cognition during this stage of life. So hormone therapy, at the moment, as it stands, the key indication that people take hormone therapy during menopause is vasomotor symptoms. So these are hot flushes and night sweats. And it is, at the moment, hormone therapy is not indicated for cognitive symptoms. So there's not enough research. And in fact, there is research that suggests, or early research that suggested, that using hormone therapy might actually increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease later in life. So at the moment, hormone therapy is not indicated purely for cognition. But there are lots of studies, and this is an area that's really evolving, because there are some studies that do show benefits on cognition with hormone therapy. And it tends to be that if hormone therapy is initiated early, so before the age of 65, so right at the start of menopause transition, it doesn't show harm later in life and might be beneficial. And we still don't know how long hormone therapy is safe in terms of the Alzheimer's disease risk later in life. So it's unclear what happens if people use it for 10 years or more, specifically in terms of the Alzheimer's disease risk. So hormone therapy is one thing that may be helpful for people, but at the moment, it's generally not prescribed on the basis of just cognitive symptoms. The other factor is lifestyle recommendations. So there's lots of lifestyle choices that have got evidence to enhance thinking skills. So one is cognitive reserve. So this is building up any kind of cognitive reserve. People with lots of education who are engaged in work, who are engaged in thinking skills, increasing your cognitive reserve is shown to enhance your cognition as well during the menopause transition. Exercise, there's lots of evidence to show that exercise, and really it's whatever exercise you like, is going to be helpful for your thinking skills. There's a bit of evidence to show that soy products, which can act on those estrogen receptors and enhance estrogen, can have some sort of benefit for thinking skills. Stress reduction in whatever form is helpful for each individual. Some people like yoga, some people like meditation, some people hate meditation, and it makes them more stressed. So it's finding whatever source of stress reduction works for you is a lifestyle choice that might help thinking skills. Engaging in not just intellectual activity, but making sure that you're socially interacting is a helpful factor. And there is also evidence in terms of diet for people following long-term adherence to a Mediterranean diet. So not within a couple of months, but years of Mediterranean diet can be helpful for thinking skills. So I also wanted to share some practical tips in terms of helping thinking skills. One is making sure we always reassure and normalize the experience of kind of brain fog or everyday memory changes during menopause. So most women, so some studies suggest up to 2/3 of women, will experience at some point brain fog during menopause. The degree of impact this will have varies for women. It can be really debilitating and concerning. but it is a normal part of menopause. It's not unusual. It's not suggesting there's something wrong with someone's brain. It's a normal part of the menopause transition. It's our brains reacting to hormone changes. It's important to take time to, within workplace or within life or with your friends or yourselves, taking the time to address the cognitive concerns. So what are the cognitive difficulties? Is it forgetfulness? Is it that tip of the tongue kind of feeling where you're forgetting words? When does it happen? Does it happen when you're more tired? Does it happen at work? Does it happen sporadically and you can't find a pattern? But just kind of exploring how and when it happens. And also, I guess from my point of view, when I do an objective test, sometimes it's comforting to let women know that their performance is still in the normal range and there's no real change in their cognitive function, but reminding women that doesn't invalidate their experience and their self-assessment of experiencing changes in their memory in day-to-day life. So the other practical tips are, and this is something that I'm developing at the moment, this group training to help women with to compensate for these day-to-day memory problems or word finding problems. So they're using compensatory strategies. So things like taking notes, they're really practical tips, but it's really good to get into the habit of doing all of these things. So taking notes, for example, during meetings, feeling confident to have a notepad with you and writing things down, using diaries, calendars, notifications or reminders, anything that any kind of memory aid you can use is a good thing. Also trying to reduce mental load. So if you've got a lot going on in your mind, doing a bit of a brain dump, just writing things down so you're not trying to juggle too many thoughts at the same time. Embedding routine and structure as much as possible into your life. And for some women, this also can extend not just in their work life, but on the weekend. So I've had spoken to women who have sort of struggle to organize their days on the weekend, and embedding some sort of structure when it's not work time can be helpful as well. It takes the decision making out of it, and taking the time to consciously attend to things. So if you feel like you really need to concentrate, just giving yourself the time to try and minimize any distractions so you really can attend. And then breaking down tasks to try and get rid of that feeling of or sense of overwhelm. So breaking down tasks and writing down the steps and ticking them off as you go. And just to finish up with, this is a paper that was put out last year about menopause in the workplace and global consensus recommendations. And I guess the key things I was going to bring up is that if not addressed, problematic menopausal symptoms can affect quality of life, engagement, performance, motivation, and relations with employers. So I guess the first step is just addressing and acknowledging menopause symptoms that people might be experiencing. And there was also a survey that was conducted, and one of the key strategies that people felt who were experiencing problems with their thinking skills during the menopause transition within the workplace, one of the key coping strategies that people found helpful was just managers having an awareness of what menopause was and the symptoms that might be experienced during that transition period. So that's, I guess, one of the key helpful changes is having education and awareness about what can happen during menopause transition and accommodating for these. So I think that was all I was going to share. So thank you very much. My email's here as well. So if anyone is interested in either participating in research or finding out more, please feel free to email me. So thank you.
That's so great, Carolyn. That's what I wish I had known, a few years before experiencing menopause. That was really, really helpful. I'm going to allow a little bit of time for questions now before we then go into thinking more concretely about implications for workplaces. So I'm just going to respond here to the chat box. Carolyn Thea, has your research or been done around symptoms being perimenopause with people having young kids versus no kids? And if there are any differences, as mummy brain also seems pretty real at times. Yeah. And then there's also the distraction of kids as well, isn't there? Have you got any comments on that, Carolyn?
I guess I don't know of any research that specifically looked at people with children, no children, children of different ages. But I think there is certainly recognition that many women during menopause are juggling lots of things, sometimes, aging parents, workplace, and children. So sometimes all of those factors that are going on in your life can certainly have an impact on stress levels, on how much you're juggling your mental load, so how much you're juggling in your mind. And the idea of mummy brain or preggy brain, or there is also research that's being conducted looking at the idea that thinking skills can change during pregnancy. And this, it's a bit unclear, I guess, but certainly the hormone changes would suggest that there could be changes in thinking skills during pregnancy as well. So, but the mummy brain, I think, is the juggling of everything that can impact people's thinking skills.
Great. I'm just going to go back to one from Sally Carter. And she said, if a woman has ADHD, it may come up more strongly in perimenopause. So what's the difference between having ADHD or just poor concentration during perimenopause? I don't know how easy that is to tease out.
Yeah, and I have seen women clinically who have a diagnosis of ADHD, or sometimes it becomes more apparent during menopause. So even though ADHD is something that people experience lifelong, it develops during childhood, people might not really identify with the symptoms until they're at that point of their life, like during menopause transition. So ADHD, there's obviously a diagnostic criteria that does include changes to attention that are generally more severe than what you would see during a natural menopause transition, but obviously they can co-occur. So it's becoming more and more common referrals about, do I have ADHD? And for me to tease it apart is again that series of assessments. And sometimes women with ADHD will show changes in their neuropsychological performance, whereas someone with menopause might not. And through interviewing women and really exploring their individual symptoms, we can generally tease apart what might be exacerbated by menopause or might be menopausal brain fog compared to something like ADHD. And then there are different management strategies as well.
Great, thank you. Kath has said, you mentioned workplaces making accommodation around menopause. What suggestions do you think would benefit women most? That's exactly what we're going to talk about in the breakout room in a moment, Kath. So I might pause on that one if that's okay, and then we'll share ideas at the end. Does anyone have any more questions specifically for Carolyn? That's right. Any research around a whole food plant-based diet from a cognitive impact?
No, at this stage, the only research that's really holding up in the cognitive literature, both in terms of healthy aging and more specifically in terms of menopause, is the Mediterranean diet. That's the one that keeps getting the big ticks. So I haven't personally seen anything about whole food plant-based diet, but it might be there as well, but it's not something I've come across.
And Carolyn, would you also mind making a comment about, what's ahead of us? So Tracy's experience was that it did improve, but I also know some women who years later are still struggling, quite badly, and for whom HRT didn't work.
Yes.
Is there enough longer term research to be able to say what our trajectory might look like on average?
Yeah, so there isn't a huge amount of longitudinal research. There's really only a couple of studies, and they tend to suggest that cognition improves, but a lot of the studies use like the word list tasks or objective tests, so they're still in the normal limit, so they're not really picking up what people are experiencing in day-to-day life. So we really need to do better studies that looked at that subjective experience, like women's experience of everyday memory problems and what the trajectory is. The feeling is that it tends to bounce back and resolve, but I feel like it's quite individual, and different people have different experiences, and that the length of time that perimenopause might last can be up to 10 years for some women. So then there can be longer periods where people experience brain fog. It might be that our brains get used to having less estrogen, less of the neuroprotective effects of estrogen, and adapt. But I think more research really needs to be conducted to better understand what the trajectories look like.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, what I think I'll do now is I'm going to pop you into breakout rooms of about 3 or 4 people. And I really want you to think about what can a workplace do to create a more brain-friendly environment for women during this life stage? What would make the biggest positive difference? And you might like to think about opportunities for creating brain-friendly ways of working, actually probably for everyone, and also some of those specific, what specific little adjustments, and they're often small, could make a positive difference. So if you just hold on, and we'll be in those breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back, and if we can use the chat box to share ideas, that would be great. So just hang tight. And some people often drop off at this point because, dearie me, scary talking to other people. I think I've got it about right. Okay, so here we go. But most people are in their rooms at the moment, but not everyone.
This meeting is being recorded.
That was very perky, wasn't it? So first of all, just a very simple blog, which is basically capturing what Carolyn covered today. We wrote up a simple article together. And if you go to the Menopause at Work Asia Pacific website and go to the blog section there, the first one is actually on cognition during menopause. So, you know, maybe that just might be a good conversation starter. Also wanted to let you know that on the Menopause at Work Asia Pacific.com website, there are some free resources on the front page there. Some of you would have downloaded them already. But one is just a simple summary of what's the business case for talking about menopause, tips for reducing the stigma, and then capturing the one-on-one interviews I conducted with working women about what their experience is actually like. And that theme of silence and trying to hide things, that's one of the most consistent themes. I also run training for managers where we talk about these kind of things and what kind of adjustments could you make. It can be in-house, or I am going to run another public training in September. If you're at all interested in getting more information, you can just send me an email or just a yes in the chat box, and I'll get back to you on that. And this can be great because you often get people from different workplaces sharing ideas. And this is so that managers can have a comfortable and constructive conversation to support women if a woman chooses that. And then just lastly, for a deeper dive, I've got a program called the Orca Effect, which I think a couple of you have participated in, where women really get to explore the different dimensions of menopause more deeply and really use it to reframe how we think about this transition, because, you know, we can see it actually as a passageway into one of the most empowering and authoritative stages of our life if we're given that support. So there's a few things you might like to check out. But let's go back to the group now. And does anyone, first of all, just have anything that they would like to contribute even by microphone? And I'm just going to keep my eye here on the participant list. Just pop your hand up if you've got something to share about what do you think workplaces could do to create a more supportive environment when women do experience some of these symptoms. Karen, is that your hand up, Karen White, or is that just a nice little clapping?
Yes. Thanks,
Yeah?
Leah.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, so in our team, one thing we spoke about was meetings. So recognising that it's important to be flexible and for workers to potentially have flexible working arrangements where they can work from home. For those who can't and have to be in the office, it was about having quiet spaces for them to go to be able to refocus. But we also discussed meetings, and I shared an experience where I worked for an organisation. When we had a meeting, the first minute of the meeting was a minute silence, in that we were able to focus on the topic that we were about to discuss and actually bring ourselves into the room ready to be present for that meeting, rather than just coming in, you're grabbing your coffee, you're throwing all your work stuff all over the desk and being, you know, sort of unorganized and not having that focus. And the other thing was, during the meeting and having time where you have a breakout time. So for someone potentially who's having, you know, a hot flush, it's about being able to say, okay, halfway through the meeting, maybe in 30 minutes, we're going to stand up and have a short stretch break. So that stretch break, it's not saying, oh, that person over there who's having a hot flush can now go and grab a drink. It's everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody stand up, have a bit of a stretch, grab a quick drink, and then sit back down again.
I love what you're sharing there, Karen, because it's actually demonstrating that the simple little things you can do in the workplace are actually good for everyone's brain. And, that's almost the basis of high performance. You take regular breaks, you have a moment to focus and still the distraction. So there are so many things like that that can be good for everyone, and you don't have to single out menopausal women. Thank you. I love those examples. They're really simple and practical. Jill, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Thea. Yeah, look, I guess I wanted to chime in and just talk about awareness. I think that, that it is such an important thing that we can do, and it's relatively simple. I love the idea of continuing the raising awareness through the formal training that I know that you run, and that has been run in a number of organisations with great success. But I think raising awareness and giving information to managers makes the perfect sense, and gives them an opportunity to understand some of the challenges and some of the really simple things that can be done that make a huge difference. So I've certainly seen the benefits of that in our organisation following the session that you ran. And so I really want to promote that as being something that I think is really good. That said, I also had a great discussion with my partner in the discussion, and we talked about a few different things, including the potential to use technology and promoting just technical tools that can be really supportive and helpful for everyone, but could really make a big difference to those experiencing those memory challenges. And again, the daily meditation was one that Lisa suggested, which I think is such a great idea, but also can be, as was suggested by Karen, can be actually used within a meeting context at the beginning of a meeting, just to get people really focused. I think that's a really neat idea.
That's excellent. Thanks, Jill. And I heard a few groups talk about, just that importance of opening up the conversation and education and awareness, and at the same time saying how difficult it can feel when you're the one affected. And I think it was from Victoria from Seek saying how helpful it is to have other people advocate for you. And I know at Seek they had some young women start a campaign around it, which was fantastic, because they're not in that squirmy, horrible position of feeling like, they're not up for their job, etc. So that idea of, having other advocates as well. And I want to pick up on what Tracy said earlier. She has to go now for another meeting, but thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing your experience. I heard a number of people relating to it in the breakout rooms, where she was saying how often older women aren't talking to us because they feel ashamed, and how do we change that? And I guess that's where there's the inner work component of it as well. We do have to learn to just, matter of fact, no big deal, this is what's happening and this is what I need, and to say that from a place of absolutely knowing your worth and what you can bring. It's not easy, but I think there is an inner work aspect to it as well. Any other suggestions about what workplaces can do? Kath, I can see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Thea. So in our group, both the other ladies said that their workplaces are trying to set up intranet resources for staff, just so that awareness is there, and manager training for awareness in both the workplaces as well. But both of them also mentioned that their workplaces were steering clear of policy, or putting it on the back burner, as it were, because, it's just like too big and too hard. And I just wanted to mention that I've recently been to England, and I met with a menopause lawyer in London, and England is so far ahead of us here. They have menopause friendly accreditation, and they're trying to get menopause as one of the 9th kind of like categories for like disability and like the anti-discrimination categories. One want to be the 9th one. But the 3rd one that we talked about was having, well-being rooms, or having, somewhere private you can go in your workplace for when you are having a hot flush, or where you are got the shits, or whether you are having a brain moment, or for women who are having menstrual cramps, or pregnant women, or whatever, any sort of place, like basically like a wellbeing women's room, really, for all that kind of thing. And a lot of workplaces, one lady mentioned that they're supposed to have one of those in every place, but in reality they don't. And Seek is really good. So one of the ladies from Seek, and she said they have 4 of these, which is great. But I reckon most places don't have anything like that. And that's what I think could make a really big difference too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for that, Kath. And yeah, when I've looked at the reasonable adjustments that could be made, 2 things that really support a whole range of symptoms: a flexible work and a quiet space. Whether you just need to recompose yourself after a hot flush or an emotional, flare up, or whether you need somewhere quiet to focus, distraction free, those 2 things actually go a long way. But thank you. And I've just seen Jill here mention, building menopause into the workplace reasonable adjustments policy can be a neat way to support access to adjustments. So some workplaces don't want to have a menopause specific policy, but you can weave it in to many others. So Jill, you've done that at your workplace, is that right? Can you just briefly comment?
Yeah, so Thea, we have done that when we were reviewing our workplace adjustments policy. We just made some minor changes, and we've promoted that with our leaders, just so that they've got visibility of it, and also shared it with our employees as well, so that they can point to that and feel a little more confident to actually make that request.
Yeah, fantastic. Does anyone else have a comment they want to make? Otherwise, I might just start wrapping up. So I guess, the way I see it is that, there's that huge piece just simply around awareness and opening up the conversation so that women coming into menopause aren't quite so blindsided like we were. Fantastic to have other champions champion the cause if you can. But then there's so much that workplaces who employ service professionals should be doing anyway to optimize brain function for all workers. So that's, do you know your priorities? Have you got distraction-free time? Are we cracking down on multitasking because that interferes with anyone's cognition? Are we having regular recovery breaks? This is where a menopause-friendly workplace can be good for everyone. And then there's probably some, more specific things that could be done for individual women, whether it's like me at the beginning of this webinar saying, I need a second brain to help me remember to press record. That's a really simple thing you can do. Or to have the quiet spaces, use the technology, like Jill said. Or maybe in some instances you need written instructions, not just verbal ones, because that's also required for anxiety, not just menopause. So I think the good news is there are a lot of really simple, practical things that can be done once we open up the conversation and normalize it, and don't see this transition from a point of view of deficit, but it's change. It's just change. And we know that change can be bumpy, but it's not forever. Does anyone have any final comments they want to make? Otherwise, I'm going to end the recording. But I am happy to stay online for a few moments if anyone does want to chat. So thanks so much, everyone, for showing up and contributing your ideas. I really appreciate it.